So maybe we will conclude with this podcast. Doesn't matter if we have one more. So this is about IMF's Debt, Investment, Growth and Natural Disaster DIGNAD model as an application to developing economies in Asia and the Pacific. The IMF's workhorse DIGNAD model extends the debt, investment and growth model of Buffy and others from this 2012 paper to analyze natural disasters and adaptation infrastructure. Reading a bit more about the model, the DIGNAD model developed in Martow, this paper here again, is a dynamic low-income or emerging country open economy model that incorporates natural disasters and resilient infrastructure to examine the nexus between public investment and growth, different financing strategies such as external concessional, external commercial and domestic finances, and fiscal reaction rules. So the assumptions here are tailored to low-income or emerging country economies, so one has to keep that in mind. It captures high rates of return on public capital, either standard or resilient, as well as significant inefficiencies in public investments and absorptive capacity constraints, which are pervasive in developing economies. How can these economies absorb the shocks or perturbations, let's say from climate change or other agents? The model captures the main mechanisms and policy issues of interest for debt sustainability analysis, particularly those associated with the linkages between public adaptation, investment, economic growth, and debt. Okay, so in that sense, it is meant to advise low-income countries and emerging economies to integrate adaptation to climate change into their fiscal policies and economic strategies and planning and policies. In the model, a natural disaster has multiple adverse effects on the economy, which can be mitigated by investing in resilient infrastructure. So let's read this as: natural disasters impact the economy through the following channels: permanent damages to the public infrastructure, permanent damages to private capital, temporary losses of productivity, increased inefficiencies in public investment during reconstruction process, and an increase in risk premium for borrowing costs. These are the categories included explicitly in the model, and there is parameterizations which translate the natural disasters into impacts on economy through these channels. Investment in adaptation infrastructure is costlier than investment in standard infrastructure, but reduces the damages inflicted by a natural disaster, for example seawalls, and depreciates at a lower rate. So standard construction that may be practiced in these countries is quicker, maybe less expensive, but it's not so resilient. So the advantages or the payoffs for investing in resilient infrastructure obviously ends up justifying the cost in that rate, in that case, and also it depreciates lower if it's made resilient. Investing in adaptation infrastructure is useful as a complement to conventional infrastructure, as it raises the marginal product of other capital by helping withstand the impact of natural disasters and crowds in private investments. Okay. The growth and debt trade-off of boosting adaptation investment can be examined with calibrated model simulations. So they have ways of specifically showing why growth debt trade-off is boosted by adaptation investment, and that's part of the purpose of the model in any case. Positive effects, as an example here, positive effects of investing in resilient infrastructure on growth and debt stability. So you can see this is a model output in that sense. So GDP growth, percentage deviation from steady state. So here you have investing in resilient infrastructure, so standard investment and adaptation investment. So when there is a shock from the steady state, so you are expecting certain growth rate and then takes a big hit in a standard investment on infrastructure, the impact is much higher, recovery is much slower, whereas infrastructure which is built for resilience has a smaller kick in the ass for GDP growth and then recovers faster and becomes positive. Here over this period considered, it's not even reached positive yet from this big loss here. Change in public debt to GDP ratio, percentage point deviation, economic terminologies. Again, you can see that the debt to public ratio can become fairly large over time if it's standard investment in infrastructure, but the adaptation investment actually keeps your public debt to GDP ratio flatter after a perturbation. So that's why depreciation also drops slower. To read off some more points before we close it out, adaptation investment, albeit costly, can make the economy resilient against natural disasters, limiting a post-disaster rise in public debt, as we can see here. Better public investment management can lessen the growth debt trade-off for adaptation investment. So there is advice given to improve the public investment management so that the growth debt trade-off for adaptation investment is lessened by, so IMF is presumably tracking economies and risks and also looking at present risks and future risks, running these sorts of model to give advice to make these reality in terms of accomplishing better infrastructure, resilient infrastructure by investing in adaptation. Financing adaptation investment with concessional external financing or revenue mobilization can also alleviate the growth debt trade-off. So growth has to keep going, debt has to be kept limited, at least in terms of not affecting the growth negatively, because this is what happened in countries like Pakistan, which one has to learn from. Okay, so Annex figure 3.2 then shows role of public investment in management and financing reforms in strengthening adaptation investment strategies. So there is the baseline. You have to figure out exactly how the baseline is defined. So we have talked about future without climate change, future without investment in adaptation, future with climate change, future with adaptation and investment in adaptation to climate change, and so on. So if you have a low investment efficiency, then you will see what happens, and high investment efficiency. So obviously there is a quantitative definition, and the model can tell you whether you have accomplished low or high investment efficiency. So public investment management reforms in terms of GDP growth, so percentage of deviation from steady state. So in the high investment efficiency, you are going at a good rate here. Here is the baseline, and then the low investment efficiency can drop below the baseline and not recover for a long time in terms of GDP growth. And change in public debt to GDP ratio in terms of percentage point deviation, again, you can argue how big the difference is, but bigger the economy, the more growth you accomplish, larger these differences become in terms of having low efficiency investment versus high efficiency investment versus the baseline. Okay, financing reforms, GDP growth here again. So this is for public investment management reform, and this is for financing reform. Again, similar story. GDP growth is better if you have concessional financing and consumption tax plus 0.5 percentage points. So obviously there are details, and these are model outputs where we are looking at sensitivities to various assumptions of financing and policies and consumption tax and so on. Similarly, we see change in public debt to GDP ratio remains high in the baseline. Concessional financing brings it down, and consumption tax brings it down even further, so that you are making people keep up with the investment needs for adaptation, or in this case resilient infrastructure, so that with increasing risks and with needs for resilient investment increasing, you are generating revenues by adding consumption tax. Okay, is that always feasible? There are examples of proposing carbon taxes, for example, and depending on how it is proposed, whether carbon tax will be added to a general pool of tax revenue so you don't know where that money is going, or if it will be kept separate so that that money will be carbon tax will be invested in improving the environment and air quality, water quality, etc. People are willing to pay or not pay carbon taxes. So details matter on how the policies are designed as well. Okay, so that finally does conclude this report staff note from IMF. We'll come back and look at one more staff note before we finalize the staff note podcasts from IMF. Okay.